All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the second NeuroMatch session on accessibility and inclusion. My name is Medina Sarvastani. I'm a postdoc at the Max Planck Florida Institute and one of the many NeuroMatch volunteers. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and a special thanks to the people who organized the session, and of course our panelists. And we also have Zahra Sarailu in the background. She's doing tech work, but you can't see her, so thanks, Zahra. Okay, so here's just a little bit about the format of tonight's session. If you've been to any of the other Prof Dev sessions, it's the same format. We'll start with brief introductions. The panelists will introduce themselves after I just briefly introduce them. And then it's really your session. So please use the Ask a Question box to post your questions for the panelists, upvote each other's questions. And the upvoting is important because we try to be democratic and ask the questions sort of in order of popularity. And with that said, I think that's it. So we'll get going. And we're waiting for a fourth panelist who will hopefully join us in a few minutes. We have Travis Hodges, who's a new assistant professor at Mount Holyoke College. His research is focused on the impact of repeated stress and altered experiences in sort of critical periods of early development. He has also been one of the proponents of paying attention to the importance of sex and age differences in our neuroscientific experimental design and studies. We have John Freeman, who's an associate professor of psychology at Columbia. His lab, the Social Cognitive and Neural Sciences Lab, focuses on how we perceive other people, how we categorize people into social groups, how we infer their emotion and their personality via facial cues, and broadly, how we understand and react to our social world. So a very relevant research topic, both of our panelists, well, all of our panelists for tonight's session. And we have Arjun Subramanian, who just finished his first year as a PhD student at UCLA. He's conducting machine learning research focused on they are conducting machine learning research focused on graph representation learning, fairness, and machine learning ethics. Arjun is also a core organizer of Queer in AI and Queer Hacks, and I'll let them introduce each of those a little bit more. And we may have a fourth panelist, as I said, joining us soon. So thank you, everyone, for sharing your time, your expertise, and your experience with us. And if you guys could tell us a little bit more about your career path, both and how you ended up in your current positions, and also a little bit about how you became involved as leaders in DEI in your fields. Arjun, if you don't mind, we'll start with you, and then you can tag the next person.
Yeah, of course. I'll try to keep this relatively brief, but basically, I want to acknowledge my positionality. I grew up in the Silicon Valley. I had access to a lot of computer science and math courses, so there was kind of this impetus to pursue something related to artificial intelligence, machine learning from a very young age, and I was very interested in building these AGI systems, a few years ago, and then I kind of got to my undergraduate, and I was seeing all this amazing work by Joy Buolamwini and Timnit Gebru about how AI is just awfully racist, and they're all the power structures and other things in which AI is embedded, and how we can better understand them. So that kind of inspired me to pursue volunteer and advocacy work with the organization Queer in AI. The goal of Queer in AI is to foster a community of queer researchers and celebrate the work of queer scientists. So we do a lot of advocacy work there as well, with name change policies and creating community education empowerment spaces. But anyways, kind of the advocacy work I was doing there, really, I found it inspiring my work in machine learning ethics and fairness, and representation learning and thinking about these socio-technical infrastructures. And so they became very inextricably linked. And I think that's really where that's how I got to where I am right now. Like as a PhD student, I'm trying to bridge together very technical things like spectral graph theory with like the queer epistemologies that underlie like our perception of social networks and queer people interacting online. How can we bring those two things together? And how can we understand them in unison and not see them as things that are like antithetical to each other? But yeah, that's basically everything is like the same thing for me. Like I feel like I see a lot of connections between all the work that I do.
Thanks, Arjun. Travis, how about we go with you next?
Yeah, sure. So I'm originally from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, one of the colder places in Canada. And I don't know why my mom decided we should move from Jamaica there, but we moved there. I was born there. I went to University of Manitoba as my undergrad. And one thing that I'm sure we might get to later on that I did not know was a thing was volunteering in different labs at the time of being at University of Manitoba. But luckily, I took a second-year course in ethology, the study of animal behavior. And through that course, I was allowed to go into the animal care facility for the psychology department at the time. And through that, I became an animal care technician at the same time that I was finishing up my undergraduate work. And as an animal care technician, I worked with animals from multiple labs, but also my professor of that second year course worked mostly with ducklings through the psychology department, and I started working with ducks. I worked with mallards for my undergraduate honors thesis. I also became very interested in stress and how that affected, well, those mallards, but also how stress affected the brain. So after doing an undergraduate thesis, honors thesis, I took an extra year to do that. I then left to go to Ontario in Canada, where I went to Brock University and went to work with Dr. Cheryl McCormick, who did a lot of work on adolescent stress in rats. So I then switched from ducklings to rats, studying how adolescent stress affected their brains, how it affected their development. A lot of age differences in the effects of stress is what I studied there. Then I went to the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, BC, to do a postdoc after getting my PhD in Ontario. So I did a postdoc with Dr. Lisa Galea, whose work is a lot to do with sex differences, especially when it comes to Alzheimer's, depression, and Parkinson's, and a lot to do with neurogenesis and how their sex differences neurogenesis and how that affects the brain as well. Through her lab, I started to work on different symptom of depression in rodents. I looked at cognitive biases, especially negative cognitive biases. So the bias of ambiguous stimuli is negative. I was looking at that in rats, and I'm continuing to look at that in rats now as in my new position. At UBC, I was a member of the Women's Health Research Cluster, so I had a lot of involvement in women's health research and was in charge of the trainees being able to present their data on women's health in a trainee seminar series, which we still have monthly. I became a member of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee for the psychology department there as well. As being one of the only Black postdoc at UBC in the psychology department at the time. I was invited to join that committee. I also became a member of Black in Neuro, which is having their week right now, talking a lot about diversity and inclusion, and they talk about that all year round. And yeah, from all of those things kind of mashed together into one, I was asked to submit an application for my current job at Mount Holyoke College. I did, went for my job talk, got the job, and now I'm here in my new office. So yes, now I'm an assistant professor here at in the Department of Psychology at Mount Holyoke College.
Perfect. Thank you, Travis. John?
Hi, everyone. So I'll also try to keep this as brief as possible. I started as an undergrad at New York University, taking some involved in labs and taking courses both in social psychology and cognitive neuroscience. And at that time, social neuroscience or social cognitive neuroscience was really just starting to take off. And it was very exciting to me. I was able to do kind of, work in both areas. And I was able to get involved in a fMRI project that was really interesting to me. So I went on to get my PhD with Nalini Ambati at Tufts University. And at Tufts, was really working with a social psychologist, but she gave me the freedom to bring the neuroscience. And so I kind of brought that to her. She gave me that flexibility, which was really appreciated. So I did continued doing functional neuroimaging, also worked on kind of new behavioral paradigms like computer mouse tracking, where you're recording participants' hand movements en route to responses and forced choice decision tasks, and looking at the trajectory of the hand movement en route to a response. And you can correlate that with brain imaging data in interesting ways to kind of figure out less conscious sorts of processes. And so during the PhD, I was doing work on person perception, stereotyping, and less conscious forms of bias, often how this can interact with the visual system. So how kind of implicitly held stereotypes, which unfortunately operate at a non-conscious level, they can also infiltrate the brain's visual system, and it just creates more entrenched kinds of stereotypes. And so there's doing that kind of research. Continued that, doing a little bit of computational modeling. After my PhD, I took a faculty position at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, which was a culture shock, to put it mildly, and I think informed some of my perspectives, as well as going on the tenure track market in all sorts of different locations in the US, having always lived in a city and seeing different kinds of kind of subcultures. And that was quite eye-opening. Spent 2 years at Dartmouth, which was really great scientifically, certainly in the sense of kind of multivariate approaches with neuroimaging data. My lab was able to absorb, that was really great. And then moved to New York University in 2014, got tenure in 2018, and as of January, just moved to Columbia, which I'm now at, and everything's been a little bit chaotic, but it's finally, as it sounds like with some of you too, in terms of starting your position, but it's finally starting to settle down now. Once I got tenure at NYU, I realized from a number of personal experiences I had, as well as hearing from junior faculty, from PhD students, from postdocs, the issues, the challenges, and the disparities that LGBTQ plus individuals are facing, and things that were certainly known to me. And it got me to write this, or try to write this piece for Nature in 2018, which tried to kind of give personal anecdotes as well as raise awareness of these kinds of disparities, and draw the kind of what I think are a bit complex connections between visibility, representation, and other kinds of kind of unique issues that I think affects invisible identities like LGBTQ plus. And when I did that, and the editors at Nature were sort of like, okay, do a serious review of the data on this issue, I really realized in the review of that data how alarming these disparities are. And of course, how this affects not only LGBTQ plus individuals, but how these intersect with race, gender, first generational status, disability, and other kinds of things for which we really don't have anything even remotely close to data on, right? We barely have any data on LGBTQ plus, let alone how these intersect with other kinds of underrepresented identities. Thank you, chat window. So what I realized from that was that in my mind, the most critical issue in terms of affecting change and changing policy and creating kind of accountability systems, besides all the really important work on visibility, such as things like Queer in AI, things like 500 Queer Scientists, which are absolutely critical, but also the way that we track race, ethnicity, disability, gender at the federal level, right, which leads to federal dollars, right, in terms of diversifying the US STEM workforce, which translates into policies. We really don't have that because US government surveys have not collected sex orientation or gender identity information. And so what I've been really focused on since 2018, which has been an absolutely fascinating, disheartening, but forward progress is certainly being made, is getting US government surveys, particularly those administered by the National Science Foundation, to collect voluntary sex orientation and gender identity information so that this information is sent to Congress in biennial reports and is able, and it's sent to universities, et cetera, so that this can actually translate into federal resources being allocated if there is statistical underrepresentation being shown, as well as driving policy and driving accountability systems. So that's what I've really been focused on over the past 4 years.
Thank you, John. We'll come back to some of the things you all mentioned, but I would like to take an audience question because we have one. This is a really good point about accessibility broadly. Academia can seem hard to break into if you haven't gone to a known or top university. What can we do to make us competitive as PhD students or postdocs if we're in a place with less resources or with less name recognition?
Yeah, I can start. Really good question. From what I can say from my experiences, starting at, and it was still like University of Manitoba, not many people know where it is or who is there, especially when I was sending out my applications to master's programs and PhD programs. It was less so the name of the university that kind of got to me in talks with who would be my PhD supervisor. She was a lot more interested in the skill set that I had, and that skill set came specifically from being an animal care technician. And being an animal care technician came from just asking, after taking that one course in my second year, asking the animal care facility if they needed any help in the facility. So I was able to work in there and work with the animals there, non-human animals in that facility without a lab at the beginning, just working in the facility, getting to know how that research was being done, which again, I never would have thought of doing or would have done if I didn't have, if I wasn't introduced to there through a course that kind of came luckily at a time. And now that I do know that those facilities exist, a lot of them sometimes are looking for volunteers. A lot of labs I know are looking for volunteers, even from outside sources. So if you're not from the university or from the college, some labs are still looking for volunteers from different areas. And that volunteer work and getting that experience definitely can help improve your application for going into a PhD program or any kind of graduate program later on.
That must have been an interesting experience in the animal colony. You know, as researchers, we're a little bit on the other side of that usually.
Yeah, it was, first off, yes, it was weird because at the moment I was thinking in my mind that I wanted to be a psychiatrist and work with humans at the beginning. So I took a lot of courses aimed towards that. But then thanks to that one course, that one experience, getting to work a little bit more closely with the animals for that one moment made me want to do that a little bit more. And then when I did that a little bit more, I realized that I wanted to continue working with rodents in particular, but non-human animals for probably the rest of my career. So that experience all kind of came as dominoes one by one after that one course in my second year, which now that I know, I try to tell a bunch of students early on to kind of look around and see what kind of labs are out there and things, and ask to volunteer, because it's something I never knew about at the time, but now that I do, it's a very strong resource.
Thanks, Travis. Anyone else care to comment?
I can comment really quickly on like the machine learning and potentially artificial intelligence side of things. So I want to acknowledge that I went to UCLA for my undergraduate. I'm going to UCLA for my PhD. It's like I don't have a whole lot of, I don't have the same experiences as likely the person asking this question, but I'm very happy about some of the new initiatives that are being organized, like the Machine Learning Collective, as well as like Big Science. These are grassroots initiatives to get people from around the world at different levels of their research careers involved in things like getting connected to mentors and doing a research project that can then get published. So, there's like you're getting the research exposure, and also there are these incentives such as publishing papers, making connections and networking that can help you long-term with applying for PhD positions and postdoc positions. I wouldn't say like there's obviously still a lot of things that need to change for them to be even more inclusive, but they're definitely better than a lot of the barriers that are in place right now with academia and other university issues. I would also say like when it comes to, one aspect is actually getting like this research experience and exposure and mentoring, and the other side is preparing your materials in a way that make you appear confident about your research interests and allow you to present like your best self when applying to these different positions. And so Queer in AI has a great application mentoring program where we connect you with a mentor, and they not only help you, so this mentor is usually more senior and has gone through the process recently. They help you put together your application materials, both from like how do you talk about your research interest in a cohesive manner to how can you talk about things like your queer identity or any other identities that you share with them as a way of motivating your research interests as well in your application materials. And I know other programs also have this, like Black in AI, for example, has an excellent mentorship program where they connect you for multiple months with a more senior individual, and they help you, they help guide applicants through the PhD and postdoc application process.
Do I remember correctly that Queer in AI also has support for grad school admissions, including some funds for?
Yeah,
right?
You're like plugging an organization for me. I appreciate it. We have like a fee aid program. So I think we are granting up to $1,250 per applicant for everything from application fees to like testing fees, etc. And this is meant to cover things like queer people being disenfranchised, like economically, having to pay for gender affirming healthcare, and especially considering things like intersectionality. Like, it's absolutely ridiculous that the GRE costs 3 times like the average salary in Ethiopia to take once. So, anyways, I won't speak longer about that because I will start cursing. But the process is stupid, and we're hoping that we can make a difference in your ability to apply through some financial aid. Ideally, we wouldn't exist because there wouldn't be financial barriers. But yeah, we're able to support up to $1,250 per person.
That's amazing. That's great. I guess I would just add, I'm curious to get your comments on this. In my experience, which has been sort of both on, I did my graduate school at Penn State, which is considered less well-known, even though it's huge. And my postgraduate work in better known places. So I've seen both sides of that, and there's definitely opportunities that you immediately have access to when your resume has some name recognition on it. But something that's worked for me is social media. I'm not even that active on Twitter, but it's given me access to a community that I didn't have. But yeah, I wonder what you guys think about that. And John, if you, I don't know if you wanted to comment on this. You guys don't have to comment on everything, by the way, but I just want to give you an opportunity.
Yeah, well, I think building on what the others have said, there's definitely a lot of, or not a lot, but a number of societies that are offering undergraduate mentorship programs or connecting. Like I'm the co-chair of the Diversity and Climate Committee at the main social psychology conference, SPSP, and also the main social and affective neuroscience society one, but we don't have that yet. We're working on it. But in terms of connecting undergraduates that desire to work with a certain PI anywhere in the world, and we offer a fair amount of a whole kind of summer, basically like a whole summer, paid summer internship. And one of the really, the positive consequences of the kind of post-COVID, or, with COVID happening, that everything is now can be remote or virtual. So there's a lot of opportunities that have availed themselves. I know for my lab, I've been, have plenty of undergraduates that work from all over the country now, right? That would have never been possible. And they work on Slack with a PhD student or a postdoc. So there's a lot of opportunities that I think that can increase accessibility, certainly. And I know this is a topic I serve on a number of diversity committees, like NIH's advisory committee to the director's working group on diversity. I've been a member for a couple of years, and I know we've talked about this before. So I think there's, with COVID happening and this broader recognition in our society that a lot of stuff can happen remote, that's certainly not hitting the STEM world. And I think now, especially in a couple of years, we're going to have more formal mechanisms to actually increase accessibility through remote culture, for less well-known institutions, and how to get those that want to get involved in STEM and move on to the next steps, how to get them into the pathway.
Thank you. That sounds like another great initiative.
Yeah. Can I add to that too?
Please.
Yeah, because yes, you both brought up great points about mentorship, and it's something that I didn't really mention too much because with my undergrad, I didn't really have that kind of mentorship that helped push me become a better candidate for certain positions. After I did my master's and PhD, then I kind of saw how much mentorship played in kind of the game of getting another position, a postdoctoral position, and things of the sort. How word of mouth kind of helped push that forward, how friendships between professors and things kind of also helped push that forward as well. Then I kind of got to see what some people call kind of the academia kind of hidden game and hidden rules of having that kind of mentor that can then help you move forward with all of your goals. It's extremely important, and all these mentorship programs that you've both mentioned, I would say very highly recommend, because a good mentor can help you go so far. Also about the Twitter that you were, or the social media that you were mentioning before, because social media also helped me kind of get this job as an assistant professor. And it kind of goes back to being at UBC and doing my postdoc there, being in those groups and being through Black in Neuro and all of those groups, through those and the Women's Health Research Cluster. Through the Women's Health Research Cluster, I did a blog for them, which got noticed on social media, especially on Twitter. And I got sent messages through that blog from new employers. Also from my work with Black in Neuro and that blog, I also got asked to do a write-up for Nature, talking about the Black in Neuro hashtag and talking about how diversity, equity, inclusion is changing in universities and colleges. And through that, I was contacted over Twitter, through a Twitter message, by 3 different institutions, one being Mount Holyoke, asking me to submit applications for this current job because they saw my what was going on in social media, and they kind of contacted me through Twitter to send in my applications. And yeah, it's played a major factor, I think, the social media, and getting my name out there a bit faster and getting them to kind of see who I was, and yeah, getting them to notice me for my application.
That's great. That's a great example of putting yourself out there and sort of, and you guys all do this, building community around yourself. And that community buttresses everyone. It helps yourself. It helps everyone else at your level. Yeah, that's great. All right, let's move on to the next question. Yeah, I think this is an important and sort of complicated question. So Rose is asking, how do you balance DEI work with your scientific research? Have you encountered pushback for spending time? Or do you feel it's hurt your evaluations on research productivity? And I would also add, have you, what advice do you have for people who, and not just trainees, faculty, everyone who gets a little pushback that this sort of work isn't as important or as relevant? I'm sure you guys have dealt with that as a bit of an uphill battle.
Okay, I could go first. Yes, so it's a good question. It was definitely, there was a little bit of pushback from my supervisor, who I didn't tell right away that I was joining the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. It was something that I was contacted about and something that I saw that I do have time here and there to come join the committee, join the talks, help them design the giant booklet of changes that they want to make to the department. That was something I kind of took on in addition to all my other responsibilities, and kind of left my supervisor a bit out of that discussion, and kind of balanced both things mostly on my own. And after the fact, my supervisor was happy about it. At the beginning, she thought that it was going to take away from my research, but it didn't end up. I feel like a lot of, well, going back to my undergrad days, when I would take those years with 4 courses versus 5 courses, and you kind of, you find a way to fit everything into, you find a way to schedule yourself and fit everything into that time and kind of get things done that you really like, if you really like what you're learning about, if you really like what you're doing. So I found ways to work on my diversity, equity, inclusion things at this points in times, work on my lab work at this points in time, and then kind of balanced it that way. It wasn't that bad for me. I think especially I was a different case because my involvement was not constantly being sent. Well, I was constantly sent emails and things, but it wasn't something that I had to attend frequently. It's something that I could find time for.
Can I ask if did your time and energy and effort on DEI, do you felt that it was rewarded externally, and that allowed you to keep it going, or you just sort of, it's important to you, you prioritized it regardless of external return?
Yeah.
I guess.
Yes, at the moment it was just important to me, and I did it regardless of the external return. There was external return after the fact, but in the moment, and some of the external return I forgot. They said at the beginning that there was going to be a bit of money given. I forgot that existed. So I was really just doing it because I wanted to. And then later got sent something and I forgot. That's
great. Very often there's no external return at all.
Exactly. And that's what I was thinking. And yeah, I was just doing it because I wanted to.
Yeah. Thanks, Travis. Anyone else?
I have a more, I'm trying to take a very realistic perspective with this too. It is definitely the case that our industry, in terms of academic science, works on, crafting your scientific identity. And obviously, if you're talking about major research universities, the priority of research and service always comes last, right? So it is a real issue, and something that, to be honest, I find a lot of students are not necessarily aware of that, and it's Something that I wish they would, because all of it has to get, if these people are to stay on in our field, the DEI work is not the only thing that is going to get them forward, which I think they certainly recognize. But it's been, I've seen a number of cases where I think students did put a lot of priority on the DEI work, and unfortunately the incentive structure that we have, it is the way it is, you know what I mean? And I think I actually have some thoughts on the Twitter culture too, because I think it's really wonderful because it's connecting people. It also is a highly kind of misrepresentative portrait of the broader, like a lot of the decision makers are tenured faculty who don't touch Twitter, who are living in a different kind of headspace altogether, and are not as up to speed with the the DEI and with the changes going on, and nevertheless they wield the power in terms of votes, right? So it's a real issue that to just add into the general incentive structures. I'll say in my experience that I kind of had a different one because I waited until tenure to do anything like that, but I'm kind of going, advocating and putting a lot of pressure on the National Science Foundation, for example, in a way that I would never do before tenure, right? And it has been fortunately rewarded, but I really didn't know how it was going to go. But I'm deeply appreciative of all the work that trainees who don't have such protected status are doing. But I also want these people to stay in our field, and so I do think the reality of it is that it is really important to push your science forward, and don't, the advice I would say is just, don't, it's amazing to reform individual departments because we need it so desperately, and to reform, culture in STEM. But if you want to stay on in the field, it isn't going to be rewarded the same way. And that's not going to be changing, unfortunately, anytime soon. I will say this is a moment, though, where there's a lot of attention on DEI. So I think, if anything, things are being, positively valued now. But if your science isn't, if you're not pushing that forward and you're trying to get a tenure track job, it is going to be an uphill battle, which, I just want everyone to know that real circumstance, although I wish it weren't the case, just because I want people to stay in the field, right? Yeah, I wish I had a more optimistic kind of perspective, but it is a real issue,
Thanks. Taking the battle up with federal agencies like NSF is along the lines of what we were thinking of getting backlash. Did you ever have a grant application out with any of these federal agencies as you're publishing these papers and opinion pieces?
I do now. I have and the thing is, it's very different. NSF, we think of NSF as a funding agency, but there's a whole other congressionally mandated part of it that is really about, ensuring the full use of human resources in the U.S. STEM workforce, ensuring, it's doing everything for U.S. scientific and technological progress. And that's why every PhD student, when they graduate from an accredited doctoral institution in the U.S., is mandated to take the survey of earned doctorates that NSF gives. That's not a lot of this work. Sometimes graduate students think like what I'm trying to do is get the GRFP to be more inclusive by having questions, which I certainly want to do, but that information isn't used to measure representation in the US STEM workforce in a way that Congress gets to then set, different kinds of policies. So fortunately, the answer to it is that it's been separate people that doesn't, I'm advocating with different kinds of administration at NSF that doesn't have to do with my grants, fortunately. And also bringing on like the American Association for the Advancement of Science and major scientific organizations have assured me that they have a whole history for decades of doing this. I've been fortunate to work with leaders like Shirley Malcolm, who in the 1970s was doing this in terms of the double bind of intersectional issues plaguing Black women in STEM. And she was up, doing all this stuff with NSF. And so having these leaders on board in terms of kind of science policy and diversity in STEM leaders that have backed me up and sort of trained me on the side of how to advocate this to NSF, to the House Science Committee, has reassured me that, oh, this is the right thing, and you're not going to get backlash in terms of your funding, your funding of your lab. So But I have an NSF grant out now. We'll see. You know, this is the first time I've submitted an NSF grant since the whole thing. But I think it's pretty separate, fortunately. You know, but I don't know. We'll see.
That's good to hear. Good luck with the grant.
Thanks.
Arjun, do you have anything to comment on this point?
I think my thoughts are not fully formed because I just finished the first year of my PhD, and I've yet to see more of the horrors that may lay in front of me when it comes to like the academic, like academic pipeline. But I think the things that I'm grateful for are that my advisors are very supportive of a lot of my diversity, inclusion, advocacy work. And I'm also very happy about it because in part, it does shape my research quite a bit. I feel like I learn a lot from doing this advocacy work that then influences my research on like, what are the ways in which we can like radically reform the way that we do artificial intelligence and machine learning. Like if we're looking to keep on developing and deploying things at scale without any context, in a very like rigid categorical way, like how does that kind of differ from the fluidity and flexibility of like everyone's identities? Yeah, so I think that part has been good. I do also appreciate Queer and AI for existing outside of academia and for operating as a decentralized and as flat as possible organization. So there's no hierarchy. Like everyone just kind of works together at all different levels of seniority, and it's good to be able to take a step back whenever I need to. I've like understood better now that relaxation is also a good form of resistance and D&I work for myself. But even when I'm there, like it feels like I'm actually making progress in a lot of ways. Like for example, enacting name change policies at different conferences. And I don't feel like I'm doing unpaid labor, which is very different from the kind of vile feeling I get when I'm working on like D&I committees often in like academia or like for certain departments. At least like my experiences have been things like I'll raise concerns and then they'll be like, oh yeah, that's a big problem. And then I'll never hear about it from them again. And I was getting very jaded with that whole process. It was taking a toll on my mental health because I was taking it upon myself to start fixing things, but that's not an environment in which I want to be. And I'm glad that there are external organizations that allow me to contribute in ways that I feel are meaningful, but that also I benefit a lot from learning from other folks who have like different intersectional identities than I do. I'm recently have been talking to a lot of folks who are at the intersections of like queerness and caste oppression, and like that has really shaped the way that I also again do research, that has reminded me that I need to keep on listening to people, that I'm in a very privileged position and I need to use that privilege to the best of my ability in a way to positively impact the folks around me.
Thanks, Arjun. You mentioned you alluded to the name change issue. I noticed as I was sort of reviewing all of the panelists' backgrounds and leadership work that Google Scholar doesn't allow name changes, and Google Scholar has become the de facto metric in publication. The H-index is now used for all sorts of evaluation and promotion in all of our careers. So that seems like a huge issue, and I had no idea. Can you tell us a little bit about it and what the response has been, if any?
Yeah, so I just want to, Google isn't a sponsor of this event or anything, right? No, we're good. We can like actually like be open about this. Am I allowed to say things?
I should have checked that. I don't think Google is a scholar of this event, but I think, or as a sponsor, but I think either way,
I'll kind of toe the line.
Yeah, toe the line. I can't guarantee anything.
Okay. Yeah, I guess like the issue is that Google does not allow you to update your names on publications. And this is obviously a big issue for a lot of trans authors who do change their names, but even more broad than that, like it's very clear that the infrastructure for Google Scholar was designed with white men like white cis het men in mind, because like a lot of women change their names when they get married, for example. Like there's just so many cases in which people want to change their names, and so just give people the agency to change their names. I don't get why it's so hard. We've been working with them, and they've come up with like this approach where you can go and contact the original publisher and change your name there, and then that will allow your scholar profile to be updated. But even that, there's just so many barriers to going and contacting individual publishers. Publishers there's no centralized policy for any of this. Sometimes they'll keep your dead name in there and then also add like your actual name. Sometimes they'll refuse to change your name. Sometimes they'll just remove your name from the publication entirely if you ask for a name change. So it's just like very inconsistent, and also there's a lot of like epistemic labor that's kind of involved. It's very ongoing in trying to get that change to be made. And I want to also clarify that it's not just about denial of credit, it's also about denial of dignity. There's also that like ongoing labor that's involved. It's also just unsafe, and it's a violation of privacy. Like if you're not out to your coworkers, like no one should be able to go through your like Google Scholar profile and like piece together other publication information on the internet and out you. Like that's like there are people who are very in danger as a result of Google Scholar's refusal to update these things. And Google has made claims like we want to ensure accuracy of publication information, but that is absolute bullcrap. Like you're like indexing cafeteria menus authored by A. Lasagna, and so like I don't get what like your why you're refusing to do this beyond just your inability to understand the severity of the situation. Like there's a large lack of empathy because they're not profiting from Google Scholar. There's no one on the Google Scholar team has like the lived experience to be able to say like this is actually affecting a lot of trans authors everywhere. And yeah, I mean, this is kind of like the issue that's very pervasive when you have these large totalizing like massive corporations or organizations that are creating these quote unquote general purpose products that have very little interest in actually benefiting everyone who's using them.
Thanks, Arjun. And the first step is sort of pointing out the problem, and you guys are all doing that work. Okay, actually, this is a related question, and very relevant to some of your research. More broadly, especially in machine learning and deep learning, large data sets are used to shape a lot of our research, a lot of our algorithms, a lot of our tools, and many of them, have biases that might stem from, like Zahra saying, a lack of cultural, regional, or representative inclusion. And these biases can have detrimental domino effects. So this is a big, broad question, but can you comment on what we as scientists and potential users of these data sets can do to fight that?
So I guess sorry, I'll just go very quickly and then I'll shut up. But effectively, like I think just the current epistemology and practices that underlie the practice of the design, development, and deployment of large scale, acontextual, like all powerful machine learning systems is really at fault for like all these biases. I think like biases are very conceptualized very narrowly, if at all, in the machine learning literature, right? Like we're talking about like racial biases and like, how like is this model like predicting that certain groups should not get a loan? Like that's very narrow and not really representative of like the fact that a lot of languages are not being included in so-called like multilingual models, that there's uneven access to compute that's required to train these large models. And so I think like if we were to really get at these biases, you can't really fight the biases or solve them. They're always going to be there because of the fundamental way in which we're practicing data set collection, curation, machine learning development, and deployment. We I think part of the reason bias has become so popular in research is because it's very incentivized by funding. It's very sexy to be able to say like, hey, we know how to measure bias and we know how to fix it. They have all these like so-called bias mitigation algorithms, but they don't always work and they don't always measure the biases that we care about. So instead, we really have to be comfortable with being interpretive, or like, yeah, very interpretive of like the harms that we see arise from the way in which these models are used. We can't restrict it to like the biases that are in data or biases in representation learning. We have to see like, how are these models interacting with real world users? What are the harms that they're experiencing? How can we best listen to their experiences, and not just through participation, but just like full inclusion? And perhaps the most extreme way in which we can get full inclusion is just throwing everything away that we have right now and just distributing the development of AI models. Like Google should not be the one like collecting all your data in a warehouse and then like making this one general purpose model that'll serve the world. Like it should be distributing compute to all parts of the world, equipping people with the ability to be their own AI researchers, where the people building the models are the ones who are benefiting from the models, who are the ones like using it, who are contributing back to the way that we're doing AI. Like the community should be like both the users and the developers. And I think if we kind of move towards that, this more decentralized distributor approach to AI research, that is a good way, or probably like the most effective way. It's obviously not going to be super practical, but it's like the most effective way to go about combating these biases that we're seeing with current AI design, development, and deployment.
Thanks.
That's great, and yeah, it's a really great information. Yes, when it comes to it is a really good question. It's when it comes to the biases also on the say like animal research side, even like the clinical research side, because what we're running into at the moment with a lot of treatments for different mental health, other diseases, is we're running into certain treatments not working for other people that are not men. And what you see is like kind of happening right now when it comes to say neuroscience research. They're trying to incentivize people to start including different sexes, different genders into their research models, or at least to say that they're going to include those different sexes, different genders into their models. Sometimes they say just to do this on the sheet for the proposal, and then they don't have actually anything in their proposal talking about that, or in their papers that come from that proposal, they don't do any of that research looking at those, say, sex differences and gender differences as one example. That is, so thank you to whoever posted that Nature article that's in the chat right now, because that's what we were kind of looking at in that article when it came to biases around using males overly in research, and how that has led to certain treatments not working when it comes to other groups, and specifically adult males as well. At the moment, I'm trying to do a lot of research aimed at throughout development and also sex differences, just to kind of combat some of this, some of the data that's out there. So things are changing slowly. I'm seeing more of something that kind of John brought up before, some of the big wigs, some of the full professors out there starting to incorporate this into their research, and then other people go, oh, if they're doing it, then maybe we should start doing it too. It's leading to a lot of initiatives based on those those with a lot more power, kind of talking about these biases and bringing that to light. It's still moving extremely slowly because there are many people in power that also do not want to change, and do not believe that the biases exist, or do not think that they need to change anything in their research. But there are certain Like I'm associated with the Organization for the Study of Sex Differences, and there's certain organizations out there right now that are kind of they're growing, their numbers are growing, the amount of trainees in those organizations are growing. There's a lot of mentors out there that have kind of similar ideals when it comes to those biases as you, so definitely seek them out to join their labs and kind of take that knowledge with you to other labs and kind of spread the word that way with when it comes to these biases. That's kind of what I've been seeing, and that's what I'm hoping will make a turn, besides waiting for some of those people in power to kind of step down, which from also a lot of my, I've seen a lot of people stay into their positions for a very, 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 very long time. So I'm hoping, I have hope. I study cognitive biases. I usually have a very strong positive cognitive bias. I like to think that things will be fine. I used to have a friend that studied belief in a just world, and I felt like I was also one of those major instances. But also, yeah, I think that things are changing, be it slowly, things are kind of changing.
Not a bad mental bias to have. That particular one.
Sometimes.
Sometimes. Okay, so we're over time, but if I could ask each of you in closing to give some advice to grad students and trainees right now who are sort of A, dealing with a couple years of pandemic, but B, watching a little bit of an exodus in our field, where people are leaving academia. A lot of the people in my own generation that I looked up to that cared about their community and cared about improving science, and just in general, people are leaving science. If we can end with some closing advice for these trainees, that would be great. John, why don't we start with you?
All right. Well, first I'd say what I hope is the obvious at this point, which is that, leaving academia is hardly should not be seen as a negative thing, right? I mean, it's certainly something that is highly valued, and I've had many, I wouldn't say many, but a number of trainees that have gone on to big tech or to startups who seem very self-actualized but obviously we, as someone who is, tenured and love academic science and being in it, and we're the ones that are doing, the things that the private world doesn't necessarily want to do, right? And we need talent and we need people, so it's really important to, in my mind, for people to be staying. In terms of advice, I would say that this has been a very understandably angsty, terrible time to be in academic science, and I really don't think very representative of the way things are, right? So I have trainees that have not been to academic conferences in person. The people, your cohort, right, is so much like the way that Twitter functions, where you feel connected to other people, but it's a fraction of, it's often the most vocal people that are on there. There's also in my mind, I think, a strong negative bias on Twitter, right? It's sort of like you're getting a lot of the issues and they're getting echoed a lot, and you're not seeing just the positive social kinds of things too, or not to the same extent. I would say that, if you're strongly interested in academic science, make sure you're reaching out to, as we already talked about, to mentors, being proactive about it. Hopefully you have a good mentor. If not, then there's, one of the nice things about this remote culture is that there's all sorts of people that are willing to help and help kind of mentor you along. And while just, I do think realism is important to consider, and I want people that are really interested in reforming our culture, which needs so much reform, academic STEM culture, in a variety of different ways, incentive structure, DEI, et cetera, that, if you want to stay in the field to really be making sure you're you're being intellectually fostered, you're getting your science done, and if you want to at your stage to be doing things, to definitely do those to help, but that you do need to, if you're gunning for a major research university, or to have a research lab of your own at a smaller college, for example, just to make sure that you are doing your science, and just to echo the different things off of, your vision, off of different mentors, right? If you want to get strongly involved in DEI, just get feedback from mentors, and recognize that, Twitter culture is praising things that are not necessarily the people that wield all the power. And I certainly I don't want my words to be seen as like, okay, let's maintain the status quo. It's just that I want people that are the most excited and most energized to change our culture to stay in our culture, right? And we have this medieval aged, as soon as you leave the culture, you have no status in our field, kind of, which is unfortunate. But just to make sure you are getting your science done, and reaching out to the mentors that can help you do that in the most fulfilling way, with the right work-life balance, and certainly in a way that, you should be feeling enabled by people and not being, disadvantaged in any way. So yeah, I sort of a smorgasbord of ideas, but it's really important that we retain talent and that we advance the careers of people, especially from underrepresented groups, especially from people that are excited to be in our field, and just, stay in there and make sure you're connecting with the right mentors and the right people to help you along.
Thank you, John, for a dose of, I would say, optimism and realism. Thank you.
I'm going to be echoing basically everything that John said. And I think, it's been apparent throughout this whole panel that we've been talking a little bit about mentorship and how important it is. It's extremely important. Pre-pandemic, I had lots of friends come in with me to start my master's, and a lot of friends who left during their master's because their mentors were horrific, and they wanted to leave the sciences because of that. I was very fortunate to find a supervisor that I actually fit very well with, and that is an extremely important thing. I've had friends who have even moved from their PhDs labs at very late stages to another PhD lab to kind of finish up their PhD in a better environment than what they were currently in. So I highly recommend, and I've seen a lot of really bad supervisors out there, really bad mentors. Highly recommend finding that there are good ones out there. It might seem like a doomsday. There are many good mentors out there. Don't be afraid to want to seek a new mentor out. Don't be afraid to speak up if you have feelings that your mentor, if that your mentor isn't and you aren't working together very well. You can move labs. It's not unheard of. People move labs, they go on, they do have great jobs. A lot of my friends are extremely happy, especially happy that they changed labs. If you feel like the lab that you're currently in is not giving you what you need, the lab that you're currently in is putting you down, you're experiencing lots of discrimination in your current lab, you can leave. You can find another lab. You can find other resources and go on. You don't have to, like John said, you don't have to stay into academia. There's many avenues. I graduated my PhD with 4 other PhD students all at the same time in the same lab. 2 of them went on to industry and they are loving their lives, and they love everything about that. First they thought they wanted to go into academia, but they found industry position that they really, really loved. I have friends of mine that are in policy that really enjoy what they do. There's so many different avenues. A bit of a plug, there's a Black and Narrow talk, a Black and Neuro panel about this coming up on Friday, I think it is, Black and Neuro Careers. You can find them on just by looking at blackandneuro.com. But they have a specific panel based on what can you do with neuroscience degrees inside academia and outside of academia. They'll be talking about that on Friday. But yeah, there's many different avenues out there. Good mentorship is extremely important. So definitely keep that in mind going on.
Thanks, Travis.
Yes, I want to like, I've heard a lot of good advice from both the other panelists, and I do want to acknowledge that a lot of people who might be listening feel very helpless in the situation as well, because there are a lot of barriers and very intentional barriers often to you being able to make changes that make you happy. So like if you're here as an international student from, I have friends who are international students from Iran, and they've been in a very like abusive mentorship relationships. It's been very hard to change labs. Like you're often balancing a lot of work, like just to get the for immigration stuff at the same time that you're doing your research. A lot of people that I know are just like financially, they need the stability of like a grad student stipend. And so there's a lot of reasons that you may not be able to make those changes. But one thing that's helped me in particular is like trying to be reflective at the end of each day. So I love journaling, and I will like kind of push that as something that I recommend that everyone does. So I tend to ask myself like a different subset of questions every day. Things like, what are the things that like made me happy today? And like, are there what things that I learned today? Like, from whom did I learn these things? Like, what am I grateful for about my PhD program right now? What am I grateful for about my hobbies right now? Like, is there anything that's making me unhappy? Like, these are just kind of questions that I just answer. And it's almost like a very qualitative analysis where it lets me like think about it, put it down on paper, and I look over the course of like days. And if I notice any like emerging themes, like right now I'm just really unhappy. I try to think like, is this that I'm not getting along or like working well with my collaborators, my mentors? Is it a more fundamental problem where I don't feel like I'm being valued, or I'm very unhappy like in my current position? And yeah, obviously the next step is harder, but at least like identifying those problems can often be tough. And I think like journaling is a really good reflective and like self-critical way to tease out like the things that I'm feeling.
Thanks, Arjun. I'll just add that when I'm feeling particularly down in my work, what usually helps is the generosity of other people. There are a lot of kind and generous people in science. Sometimes they'll come to you. Sometimes you have to seek them out. But there's a lot of people doing good work, and you guys are a good example of that for tonight. Thanks for sharing your time and your experience and giving us some advice and optimism and realism. And thanks to everybody else for tuning in, and for Zahra for helping us in the background. And with that, I'll say good night. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.